The waves of the Black Sea crashed against the fortress walls of Trabzon, a city that sat at the easternmost edge of the Ottoman Empire like a lone sentry watching the wilderness. It was here, in a provincial governor's mansion overlooking cliffs and storm-tossed waters, that Suleiman was born in the autumn of 1494. He entered the world not amid the fanfare of Constantinople, but in the hard, salt-laced air of the frontier, where merchants from Genoa crossed paths with Persian emissaries, and soldiers patrolled roads where wolves sometimes outnumbered men. His father was Shehzadeh Selim, a prince not yet sultan but already feared. Stern, unflinching, and quick to violence, Selim had earned the title Yavuz, the Grim, even before bloodshed became his calling card. His mother, Hafsa Sultan, came from the Crimean Tatar aristocracy and brought to her son a keen intellect, religious devotion, and an instinct for diplomacy that would prove essential in palace life. Suleiman's earliest memories were of books and blades. Tutors recited Quranic verses while Janissary captains drilled him in archery and horse riding. He was raised with the expectation that one day he would govern, but not necessarily rule. Ottoman succession was never a promise. It was a contest. At the age of 7, Suleiman was sent to Istanbul, to the palace school within Topkapı, where future leaders were molded. There he studied Arabic, Persian, Turkish law, philosophy, history, and poetry. He read the great mystics, Rumi, Saadi, and Hafiz, and wrote verses of his own under the pen name Muhibi, meaning the lover. Even as a boy, he carried an air of seriousness, reserved, thoughtful, and never given to excess. Unlike other princes who sought revelry, Suleiman preferred ink to wine and strategy to gossip. By age 15, he was appointed governor of Kaffa, a wind-beaten post in the Crimean Peninsula, far from the polished elegance of the capital. The experience would prove invaluable. There, in a world of treacherous politics, tribal raids, and struggling merchants, Suleiman learned pragmatism. He handled disputes between Orthodox Christians, Muslim Tatars, and Jewish traders with calm, often writing his own judgments and leading council meetings by lantern light. Soon after, he was transferred to Manisa, a lush city near Izmir, far closer to the heart of the empire. It was from there that he watched events unfold with increasing urgency. His grandfather, Sultan Bayezid II, was aging. The Ottoman court seethed with factionalism. Powerful pashas debated which son of Bayezid would succeed: Ahmed, the favored heir; Korkut, the pious scholar; or Selim, the ruthless warrior. Suleiman knew his father's temperament. Selim would not wait. And he was right. In 1512, civil war gripped the Ottoman Empire. Selim marched on Constantinople, forcing his own father into abdication. His brothers were executed, and their sons soon followed. The bloodline narrowed to a single branch. Selim Themarmar, and now Sultan, wasted no time. Within months, he had defeated the Safavid Shah Ismail at the Battle of Chaldiran, seizing eastern Anatolia and humiliating Persia's greatest Shia monarch. 2 years later, he crushed the Mamluks of Egypt, annexing Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The Ottoman Empire became not only the largest Sunni Muslim polity, it now held the sacred custodianship of Islam itself. Suleiman, accompanying his father on many of these campaigns, observed but rarely interfered. He understood power and how swiftly it turned. While others tried to curry favor, Suleiman remained deliberate, modest, and calculating. Though young, he grasped something many others missed. An empire ruled by fear cannot endure. One ruled by law perhaps can. And then, in 1520, the thunderous march of Selim I came to a halt. At just 49 years old, the Sultan succumbed to a festering abscess. Some said plague, others cancer. Whatever it was, it took him swiftly, and for a brief moment the empire stood still. All eyes turned to Suleiman. There were no rivals left. Selim had seen to that. On September 30th, 1520, Suleiman entered Topkapi Palace not as a prince, but as the 10th Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. He was 26, tall and lean, his black beard barely full, his eyes calm yet unreadable. He carried no ornate weapons, wore no extravagant silks. Instead, he appeared at the throne room in a plain caftan holding a single scroll, his first imperial decree. He read it aloud to the council. Let there be justice where there was ambition. Let the farmer sow without fear, the merchant trade without tax, the worshipper pray without dread. We are entrusted not with gold, but with souls. The viziers listened, nodding politely. Whispers soon followed. Too soft, some muttered. A scholar, not a warrior, others said. But Suleiman was listening too. Within weeks, he proved them wrong. In a calculated gesture of both mercy and strength, he released thousands of prisoners but dismissed or demoted corrupt officials. He lowered taxes in Anatolia but raised revenues through stricter trade oversight. He held court more frequently than his father ever did and shocked the palace by inviting ordinary citizens, merchants, farmers, even women, to appeal injustices directly to him. Yet his gaze was always forward. To the north, the fortress city of Belgrade stood as a Christian bulwark on the Danube, its defenders weary and underfunded. Suleiman understood the symbolism. If Belgrade fell, Europe would tremble. If it stood, the Sultan would be seen as weak. He summoned the divan. Maps were unrolled, roads to Hungary were studied. Then with measured clarity, Suleiman announced, "In the spring we march." But even as he planned conquest, Suleiman wrote poetry. Alone in his chambers lit by oil lamps, he penned verses of love, longing, and fate. Often he addressed an unknown muse, perhaps a concubine, perhaps a dream. One fragment survives. Crowned not by jewels but by justice, I hold a heart more than a throne. As the snows of winter 1520 fell over Istanbul, a new empire began to stir. Suleiman, though young, was unlike any sultan before him. He was not merely a warrior nor simply a scholar. He was both and something more, a ruler who believed in law, faith, poetry, and expansion. A man who understood that the sword could win land, but only wisdom could hold it. And so, in the silence before the storm, the empire held its breath. The Magnificent was rising. Fire and Crescent, 1521 to 1536. When the winter thawed in the spring of 1521, the fields of Rumelia, the Ottoman-ruled Balkans, quivered under the march of war. Tens of thousands of troops, janissaries clad in crimson and gold, sipehis on proud horses and camel-drawn artillery caravans surged toward the northwest. At their head rode a calm young man beneath a white turban edged in gold thread. Suleiman, now firmly enthroned, was not merely defending Ottoman borders, he was reaching for the heart of Europe, his first target Belgrade. For centuries, Belgrade had been the thorn in Ottoman flesh. It had defied Mehmed the Conqueror, frustrated repeated campaigns, and stood as a Christian bastion at the confluence of the Danube and Sava rivers. Yet by 1521 its defenses were thin. Hungary's king, Louis II, was distracted by internal unrest and foreign diplomacy. Its walls were tall, but its will weak. Suleiman laid siege in July. His engineers constructed floating bridges, diverted water supplies, and rained fire upon the fortress. Cannons roared day and night. On August 29, 1521, the same date on which his greatest victory would one day fall, Belgrade surrendered. The Ottomans poured in, but Suleiman forbade a massacre. The citizens were spared, churches converted, and a mosque was built where the Great Cross once stood. Europe watched in horror. The boy Sultan had moved with speed, precision, and mercy, something altogether unfamiliar in the age of brutal conquest. And he was not finished. Suleiman returned to Istanbul a hero, but he spent little time in celebration. His next vision lay in the Aegean, where a far older enemy still clung to power. The Knights of St. John, Christian warrior monks fortified on the island of Rhodes. These knights, though few in number, had long disrupted Ottoman shipping, captured Muslim pilgrims, and humiliated sultans for over a century. Even Mehmed II had failed to dislodge them. But Suleiman would not. In June 1522, a fleet of 400 ships and over 100,000 troops set sail for Rhodes. The siege lasted 6 brutal months. The knights under Grand Master Philippe de Villiers de l'Isle Adam fought with unmatched bravery. Underground tunnels collapsed. Ottoman sappers were buried alive. Cannonballs shattered towers, yet the defenders rebuilt them by night. Suleiman, who personally oversaw the siege, respected their valor. When the knights finally surrendered in December, he offered them generous terms. They could leave with dignity in arms. The Grand Master bowed before the young Sultan, declaring, "You fight like Alexander, but rule like Solomon." The world was beginning to see what kind of ruler Suleiman would be. As Suleiman carved his way through Europe and the Mediterranean, the political chessboard shifted. The year was 1525, and the Battle of Pavia had just reshaped Western Europe. Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, had captured Francis I of France. With France temporarily humbled and the Habsburgs ascendant, Suleiman recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity to press deeper into Central Europe. His eyes turned to Hungary, a kingdom in decay. King Louis II, just 20 years old, was popular among nobles but politically ineffectual. Corruption drained the treasury. Peasant uprisings flared, and the Catholic clergy taxed the population into despair. The kingdom was ripe for collapse. Suleiman mobilized his forces again in 1526. As his legions thundered through the Balkans, Christian scouts fled before them. The skies turned dark with ash. Ottoman banners stretched for miles, and the great Topkapı artillery pieces were hauled on wheels the size of water wheels. At Mohacs, on the Hungarian plain, Louis II made his stand. He brought 25,000 soldiers, including German mercenaries and cavalry knights. Suleiman fielded twice that number, and unlike the Hungarians, his army was unified, disciplined, and equipped with elite janissaries, matchlock muskets, and field cannons. On August 29, 1526, under a pale and misty sky, the battle began. The Hungarians launched a cavalry charge that pierced the Ottoman front, but it was a trap. As they pressed in, the flanks collapsed inward, and Ottoman artillery opened fire. Cannons roared like thunder, tearing into armored men and horses. Within 2 hours, the Hungarian line disintegrated. King Louis, fleeing the field, was thrown from his horse while crossing a muddy river and drowned under the weight of his armor. By dusk, 20,000 Hungarians lay dead, including the flower of their nobility. The Ottoman dead numbered less than 2,000. Suleiman stood amidst the corpses. The once proud kingdom of Hungary had collapsed in a single day. Europe again was in shock. As Suleiman carved his way through Europe and the Mediterranean, the political chessboard shifted. The year was 1525, and the Battle of Pavia had just reshaped Western Europe. Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor, had captured Francis I of France. With France temporarily humbled and the Habsburgs ascendant, Suleiman recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity to press deeper into Central Europe. His eyes turned to Hungary, a kingdom in decay. King Louis II, just 20 years old, was popular among nobles but politically ineffectual. Corruption drained the treasury. Peasant uprisings flared and the Catholic clergy taxed the population into despair. The kingdom was ripe for collapse. Suleiman mobilized his forces again in 1526. As his legions thundered through the Balkans, Christian scouts fled before them. The skies turned dark with ash. Ottoman banners stretched for miles, and the great Topçu artillery pieces were hauled on wheels the size of water wheels. At Mohacs, on the Hungarian plain, Louis II made his stand. He brought 25,000 soldiers, including German mercenaries and cavalry knights. Suleiman fielded twice that number, and unlike the Hungarians, his army was unified, disciplined, and equipped with elite janissaries, matchlock muskets, and field cannons. On August 29th, 1526, under a pale and misty sky, the battle began. The Hungarians launched a cavalry charge that pierced the Ottoman front, but it was a trap. As they pressed in, the flanks collapsed inward and Ottoman artillery opened fire. Cannons roared like thunder, tearing into armored men and horses. Within 2 hours, the Hungarian line disintegrated. King Louis, fleeing the field, was thrown from his horse while crossing a muddy river and drowned under the weight of his armor. By dusk, 20,000 Hungarians lay dead, including the flower of their nobility. The Ottoman dead numbered less than 2,000. Suleiman stood amidst the corpses. The once proud kingdom of Hungary had collapsed in a single day. Europe again was in shock. Victory did not inflate Suleiman's ego. If anything, it drove him inward. After Mohacs, he returned to Istanbul and turned his focus to domestic affairs. The empire had grown vast, stretching from Baghdad to Budapest, from Algiers to Mecca. But it required more than conquest to endure. It required law. Suleiman began a process of legal harmonization that would define his reign. Known in the Islamic world as Kanuni, the lawgiver, he reorganized the empire's vast and complex legal structure. Sharia law, imperial decrees, regional customs, and trade codes were consolidated into a unified body of legislation. He introduced tax reforms, protected peasant rights against landlord abuses, and ensured non-Muslim communities, dhimmis, retained their religious and cultural autonomy in exchange for the jizya tax. Christian and Jewish communities flourished under this system, allowed to maintain churches, synagogues, and internal courts. Simultaneously, Suleiman poured imperial wealth into architecture, hiring the young genius Mimar Sinan, a former janissary turned master builder. Grand mosques, aqueducts, bridges, and libraries sprang up from Damascus to Sarajevo. Yet even in this golden age, power stirred in the shadows. No man was closer to Suleiman than Pargalı Ibrahim, a Greek-born Christian taken as a child through the Devshirme system, raised in the palace, and educated beside the young Suleiman himself. In their youth they shared books, games, and secrets. Now, as men, their destinies intertwined. Suleiman elevated Ibrahim to Grand Vizier in 1523, a move that stunned the court. A former slave had risen to become the second most powerful man in the empire. But Ibrahim was no ordinary vizier. Fluent in multiple languages, skilled in diplomacy, and trusted absolutely by the Sultan, he became the architect of Ottoman foreign policy. He negotiated trade agreements with Venice, opened secret correspondence with France, and secured truces that kept the eastern frontier quiet. He once declared, "Where my master's sword carves land, I shall build bridges." And build he did. But envy followed him like a shadow. The old guard at court, Turkish nobles, pashas, and clerics, resented the rise of a foreigner. Rumors whispered of Ibrahim calling himself Sultan's brother in private, and of exceeding his station. Suleiman ignored them, for now, by 1535, the empire's reach extended further still. The Barbary coast fell under Ottoman suzerainty. Algiers, once a pirate haven, became an imperial port. Under Admiral Barbarossa, the Ottomans challenged Spanish control of the Mediterranean. At the same time, Suleiman strengthened ties with France, then ruled by Francis I, recently released from Charles the Iron's prison. A formal alliance, the first between a Christian monarch and a Muslim sultan, was forged in secret. France would harass the Habsburgs in the west, the Ottomans in the east. It was a geopolitical masterstroke. Suleiman's empire stood at its zenith. Never had it stretched so far, never had it been more stable, never had a sultan ruled with such prestige across both the Muslim and Christian worlds. And yet within the palace walls a storm began to gather. It wore the face of a woman, somewhere amid the scented courtyards of Topkapi. A young concubine had caught Suleiman's eye. She was red-haired, sharp-tongued, and unlike any woman he had known. Born in Ruthenia, taken by Tatar raiders and sold into slavery, she arrived at the harem nameless. There she became Hürrem, the cheerful one. She made Suleiman laugh, challenged his thoughts, and even debated his poetry. He soon took her not only into his bed, but into his heart. He broke centuries of precedent by marrying her, elevating her to legal queen, a title no sultan's consort had held before. The harem, once a quiet space of ceremony and hierarchy, became political. Hürrem maneuvered through it with deadly grace, and she had her eyes set on securing power for herself and her sons. But that tale of seduction, ambition, and blood was still to unfold. For now, Suleiman the Magnificent stood atop a world carved by fire and held by crescent. Sultan and the Sword, 1536 to 1553. In the early morning hours of spring, the silhouette of Süleymaniye Mosque began to emerge over the skyline of Istanbul, a dome rising like the sun, flanked by soaring minarets that pierced the sky like lances. This was not merely a mosque, it was a message, a monument to power, piety, and permanence. A tribute not to the transient victories of war, but to something far more enduring: law, vision, and empire. At its foundation stood the man who had dreamed it into being. Suleiman, now approaching middle age, still upright and regal but softened by the passing years. His beard, once black as ink, now held flecks of silver. His steps remained steady, but his eyes, those ever-watchful eyes, betrayed a man who had seen too much and trusted too few. Though many across Europe would remember Suleiman as the conqueror of Rhodes, Belgrade, and Mohacs, in the Islamic world he would forever be known as Kanuni, the lawgiver. The empire he ruled was vast, diverse, and difficult to govern by sword alone. Suleiman knew that glory won on the battlefield could be lost in the courts. And so, in one of the most remarkable undertakings of his reign, he turned his attention inward, towards the intricacies of law and justice. He summoned qadis, judges, jurists, clerics, and scholars to his court and began the process of codification. He did not rewrite the Sharia, divine Islamic law, but he harmonized it with Kanun, the secular imperial statutes. His goal was clarity, fairness, and unity. Under his hand, tax burdens were regulated, land tenure was restructured. Feudal lords, Timariots, were subjected to closer scrutiny. Non-Muslims were protected by detailed legislation, allowing them religious freedom and communal autonomy in exchange for loyalty and tax. He insisted that justice was the spine of empire, and he took pride in walking among his people in disguise to hear their complaints. Folk tales tell of Suleiman entering bakeries, ports, and mosques dressed as a merchant or a clerk, judging for himself the fairness of his administrators. Even European envoys marveled at the sophistication of Ottoman law. The Venetian ambassador wrote, "Here the Sultan is feared as a lion but revered as a priest. His word is sharp, but his pen is sharper." But even as the empire thrived, its heart began to fracture. For over a decade, Ibrahim Pasha had stood at Suleiman's side. Once a Greek slave, he had become Grand Vizier, commander of armies, and even the de facto foreign minister of the empire. His signature adorned treaties with France, his strategies governed campaigns in Persia, and his charisma captivated courts across Europe. But power breeds envy, and Ibrahim's star began to burn too brightly. He built a palace to rival the Sultan's own. He referred to himself as Serasker Sultan in foreign correspondence. He wore robes once reserved for the royal family. At official events, he seated himself as an equal to the monarch. In the corridors of Topkapi, whispers grew louder. Was he merely loyal or dangerously ambitious? None whispered louder than Hürrem Sultan. The queen, ever watchful, saw in Ibrahim not just arrogance but a threat to her own rise. He was loyal to Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son by another woman, Mahidevran. Mustafa was popular with the army, charismatic, and seen as the natural heir to the throne. To Hürrem that meant danger, for herself and for her sons. She began sowing doubt, delicately, strategically. Letters, glances, rumors. She raised concerns about Ibrahim's correspondence with foreign powers. She questioned his ambitions in the eastern campaigns. She noted his closeness to Persia, Ottoman Islam's heretical rival. The tension culminated one night in 1536. After a grand banquet at Topkapi, Suleiman invited Ibrahim to spend the night in the palace, as he had done many times before. The vizier retired to his chamber, oblivious to the silent figures approaching. By dawn, Ibrahim Pasha was dead, strangled by palace guards with a silken cord, silent, swift, and final. His body was buried in secret, his name removed from records, his family stripped of wealth and honor. The empire lost its brightest statesman. But Suleiman had made his choice. In Ibrahim's absence, Hürrem Sultan rose to prominence. No longer just the Sultan's favorite, she became his wife, a queen not in title alone, but in influence. She wrote foreign letters in elegant Ottoman Turkish and diplomatic Latin. She built mosques, schools, and soup kitchens. She advised the Sultan on appointments and domestic policy. Ambassadors requested audiences with her. In Europe, she became known as Roxolana, the red-haired enigma of the East. But her greatest influence lay in shaping the future of the empire. She bore Suleiman 5 children, including Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir. She lobbied hard to ensure that her sons, not Mustafa, would inherit the throne. The harem, once a place of confinement, became a center of imperial politics, with concubines, eunuchs, and slaves all part of an intricate web of alliances and rivalries. Did Suleiman more than the issue of succession? Ottoman tradition was brutal. Only one son could rule. The others would be executed to prevent civil war. But which son? Prince Mustafa, born of Mahidevran, was the oldest, most accomplished, and beloved by the army. He had governed Manisa and Amasya with wisdom. He had charisma, military skill, and the legacy of lineage. Yet he was not Hürrem's son. In 1553, as Suleiman prepared to campaign once more into Persia, he summoned Mustafa to his war camp in Konya. Rumors swirled that letters had been intercepted, allegedly from Mustafa to the Safavids, suggesting a coup. Whether forged by Hürrem and her allies or real remains a mystery. Suleiman, torn between love and paranoia, made a decision that would haunt him to his grave. When Mustafa entered the tent, he was greeted not with an embrace, but with executioners. He struggled, cried out, even fought, but 3 silent men closed in with a bowstring. He died gasping on the floor, the tent walls muffling the final act of one of the most tragic deaths in Ottoman history. The soldiers rioted, the court mourned, and Suleiman wept in private. "I gave birth to empire," he wrote, "but buried my own soul." Amid tragedy, the empire still expanded, this time upon the waves. In the Mediterranean, the Ottoman navy had grown formidable under the legendary Hayreddin Barbarossa, a pirate turned admiral who unified North African corsairs under Ottoman rule. Suleiman named him Capudan Pasha, commander of the fleet. In 1538, Barbarossa defeated the Holy League at the Battle of Preveza, securing Ottoman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean for decades. Spanish ships were raided, Italian ports blockaded. The Venetians, once maritime kings, paid tribute in gold. The Ottomans also controlled Red Sea routes, challenged the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean, and launched expeditions as far as Yemen and India. The empire, once landbound, now touched every shore between Gibraltar and Gujarat. Suleiman ruled not only with the pen and sword, but with the anchor as well. By the end of 1553, the cracks were beginning to show. Suleiman was now nearly 60, a lifetime of wars and governance carved into his face. He still led campaigns, still dictated decrees, still wrote poetry by candlelight. But the toll was evident. The loss of Ibrahim and Mustafa had taken something from him. The laughter that once filled court poetry now gave way to sorrow. His verses turned mournful. His eyes, once sharp, now stared longer into silence. "I conquered worlds," he wrote, "but not my heart." And beyond the palace, the seeds of future unrest were sprouting. His son Bayezid and Selim quarreled. The empire's economy, though still vast, was beginning to feel the strain of continuous war. Corruption re-emerged in the provinces. The provinces of Arabia and Anatolia simmered with dissent. Still the empire held. Because Suleiman held it, he was no longer merely magnificent. He was eternal, or so it seemed. But even sultans must eventually walk into the dust. By the end of 1553, the cracks were beginning to show. Suleiman was now nearly 60, a lifetime of wars and governance carved into his face. He still led campaigns, still dictated decrees, still wrote poetry by candlelight. But the toll was evident. The loss of Ibrahim and Mustafa had taken something from him. The laughter that once filled court poetry now gave way to sorrow. His verses turned mournful. His eyes, once sharp, now stared longer into silence. "I conquered worlds," he wrote, "but not my heart." And beyond the palace, the seeds of future unrest were sprouting. His son Bayezid and Selim quarreled. The empire's economy, though still vast, was beginning to feel the strain of continuous war. Corruption re-emerged in the provinces. The provinces of Arabia and Anatolia simmered with dissent. Still, the empire held, because Suleiman held it. He was no longer merely magnificent, he was eternal. Or so it seemed, but even sultans must eventually walk into the dust. Twilight of the Magnificent. The great halls of Topkapi Palace had grown quieter. The voices of grand viziers no longer echoed with as much certainty. Courtiers bowed deeper, and the eyes of foreign ambassadors watched with greater calculation. For all the majesty of Suleiman's empire, its walls of stone, its seas of ships, its endless provinces, there was something unmistakable in the air. Time was winning. Suleiman, now over 70 years old, still rose before dawn. He still read petitions, signed decrees, and walked the palace gardens with his cane. But the fire that had once driven him across continents now flickered beneath layers of sorrow. He had buried his closest friend Ibrahim Pasha and watched his most promising son Mustafa strangled in the dust of a military tent. His beloved Hurrem Sultan, the queen who had risen from slavery to shape an empire, had died in 1558, leaving a silence in the palace that nothing could replace. His health faltered, his legs swollen from gout, his back bent from age, his nights broken by dreams of ghosts. And yet in his solitude duty remained. As long as he breathed, he believed the empire would hold. In 1566, rebellion stirred in the heart of Europe. Hungary, long fractured since the Battle of Mohacs, was again contested between pro-Ottoman and Habsburg factions. A Christian noble, Miklos Zrinyi, had fortified himself in the castle of Sigetvar, blocking the Ottoman route deeper into Europe. The Sultan's advisors counseled against action. "Let others fight," they said. "Let younger men lead." But Suleiman would not be remembered as a man who let others finish what he had begun. Against the advice of physicians and statesmen, the old lion mounted one final campaign. The summer of 1566 was brutal. The sun scorched the Hungarian plains, and the march from Istanbul to Sigetvar stretched the limits of even seasoned janissaries. Suleiman, riding in a gold-covered litter rather than on horseback, remained veiled from view, seen only by his inner circle. He rarely spoke. But each day he signed orders and sent prayers. When the army reached Sigetvar, the siege began with fury. Ottoman artillery thundered against the fortress walls. Arrows fell like rain. Mines were dug beneath the bastions, but Zrinyi, knowing he would not survive, chose to fight with the rage of a man facing death. Days turned into weeks. The Ottomans breached outer defenses, but the core stronghold held. As each wall fell, Zrinyi pulled his remaining men into smaller quarters, setting fires behind them. Still, Suleiman did not retreat. But as the siege reached its climax, far from the front lines, the Sultan's tent fell silent. In the early hours of September 6, 1566, Suleiman the Magnificent died in his campaign tent, 72 years old after 46 years on the throne. His death was kept secret by the Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who feared chaos if the soldiers learned their emperor was gone. Suleiman's body was embalmed and placed in a sealed casket. His heart and organs, as tradition demanded, were buried near the battlefield. 2 days later, Zrinyi and his men made a final charge from the flaming ruins of the fortress. They died in a blaze of glory, and the Ottomans claimed victory. But the man who had ordered the campaign never saw its end. The news of Suleiman's death was carried slowly back to Istanbul, where it was announced with somber ceremony. Black banners were hung from mosques. Clerics wept in the streets. Poets composed elegies by the hundreds. He was buried in Süleymaniye Mosque, the towering masterpiece that bore his name, overlooking the Bosphorus. It remains there to this day, a monument not only to his reign but to the vision of an empire built on law, art, and conquest. Under Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, from North Africa to Crimea. He had ruled longer than any sultan before or after him. He had commanded armies, written poetry, passed judgment, and redefined sovereignty in the Islamic world. He was remembered by many names: the Magnificent to the west for his splendor and power, Kanuni, the lawgiver, to his own people, and in his own verses simply as Muhibi, the lover. After his death, the empire endured. His son, Selim II, inherited the throne, though lacking the steel of his father. The cracks that Suleiman had once sealed with law and diplomacy began to widen. The empire would continue for centuries, but its golden age had passed. History would look back on Suleiman not as a man untouched by grief or error, but as a ruler who bore the weight of empire with dignity, complexity, and unmatched grandeur. His twilight was not the end, but the beginning of a legend.